Hey, what's up guys? Marc here. Welcome to a new anatomy lesson, part of my series covering the entire human body. Each of these mini lessons for artists cover a specific body part with the ultimate goal of helping you draw the entire human figure better. For more in-depth content, make sure you visit my QBrush store and consider joining my complete art education program, Art School for Digital Artists. If it's your first time shopping on QBrush, make sure you use my discount code to save 20% off your entire order. Also, follow me on Instagram for daily art updates. In this first episode, we'll learn about the human skeleton and how to draw it. Let's go. Alright, so this first episode, we are going to talk about the frame of our body, the skeleton. So just like a house, if you need to build a house, you need to have a foundation so that you can build everything else on top of that. And our foundations, that's our skeleton. Now, we don't only have a skeleton, the skeleton is not everything. We have bones. On top of that, we have muscles, but then to hold the bones together, we have ligaments. And then to attach those muscles onto the bones, we have tendons. What we are going to cover in the context of this mini series is going to be mostly just skeleton and muscles, because that's really what impacts the silhouette of the body. That's what impacts kind of the surface of the body. So those are all things that are very, very important for us artists. And hopefully by the end of this series, once we're done with all the different episodes, there's going to be many of them because there's a lot to cover. But at the end, we should be really knowledgeable about the human body. And as a result, it should definitely help you draw it better. Now, why would you want to learn anatomy? Well, if you're a character artist, it's one of those skills that impact everything else that comes after that. So it impacts, if you're a concept artist, you're going to need to know anatomy. If you're a 3D character artist, you're going to need to know anatomy. If you're a comic book artist, you're going to need to know anatomy. If you draw, if you sculpt figures to be 3D printed, that kind of stuff, you need to know anatomy. So character artists don't have a choice. Anatomy is one of the most important skills, one of the most fundamental skills that you can have. But art, like many other things, is not a spectator sport. It's something that you have to do. You can't just watch these videos and expect that you're going to be, amazing at anatomy after that. Hopefully the videos will help you learn faster. That's the whole point of this. I'm going to try to synthesize everything, all the different bits of knowledge into short, compact, to the point videos, so that there's really no question as to what you should be learning. It'll all be there. But you still got to do the work. So then, the human skeleton. This is going to be the first thing that we cover. And if you look at it, it can be pretty daunting, right? So the skeleton is very complex. There's a lot of different bones. But as artists, just like with the muscles as well, we don't need to know everything. So when we start tackling the muscles, we're going to look at mostly surface muscles, all the deep muscles. Not so relevant most of the time because they don't really impact the silhouette of the body. They don't impact, the surface that you'll have to shade, that you'll have to sculpt, that you'll have to draw, We don't really see them. And so for artists, not as relevant. But the skeleton is where everything else is attached. And so to really understand how the muscles work, how they're organized, which muscle is on top of which, what they should look like in different angles, you have to know where they attach and where they insert onto the bones. And that's really the magic ingredient in all of that. It makes a massive difference once you can make the connection between the two. And so I'm going to really be focusing on that. But just like muscles, we don't need to know all the different bones in the human body. So there's way too many to be bothered, memorizing them all. Of course, you can always do that if you want to, but a lot of the different bones are not going to be visible. A lot of the different bones are not really relevant when it comes to surface muscles. So in context of this mini series, we're actually going to only look at about a dozen bones/bone groups. So it's going to be a lot simpler. Now, of course, when we look at the different muscles and more details, the different groups of muscles, we're going to also look at different bones, and we'll look at everything into more details. But for this first lesson, and to be able to eventually turn that skeleton, those basic bones that we're going to learn, into some sort of a mannequin that we can then draw in different angles, that we can pose, that we can start to practice with, right? Something that will eventually be able to attach muscles on top of. To create that mannequin, we don't need to know that many things. We don't need to know that many bones. And so let's just go right into it and start with a pair of bones that's going to be very visible in most characters, and that is going to be the collarbone. So collarbone, or also called the clavicles. So the clavicles attach in the front here to the manubrium of the sternum. So the sternum, that's going to be one piece, one part of the rib cage that we're going to take a look at a little bit later. But it's basically 3 sections, and the top section is called the manubrium, and that's really where the clavicles attach onto. Now the clavicles might seem like, you know, pretty small bones, but they are actually very important, and they deform a lot. They move around a lot, you know, when you move your arms, and they're also there to support a lot of the different muscles of the chest, the shoulders, and the back, also the neck. And when they connect here at kind of like the tip of your shoulder, they also meet with the scapula, which is going to be the next bone that we are going to take a look at. So the scapula is kind of this triangle shaped bone, also called the shoulder blades. And when they meet here at the tip of the shoulder with the clavicles, it kind of creates a socket for the humerus, which is going to be the upper arm bone. And it will also be visible depending on the position of your arm. So if you push your elbows back, you know, your clavicle, your scapula will tend to poke out of your back a little bit more. And so sometimes you'll be able to see it. But yeah, basically it's just a bone that has a lot of applications, not applications, but where a lot of different muscles are going to be attached onto. So you're gonna have a bunch of different muscles in the back, your deltoids, muscles in the neck, some muscles of the torso as well. So even your biceps, your triceps. So pretty important one. And then from there we have the humerus. So that is going to be the bone of the upper arm, and it's a single bone, and pretty simple, but again, very important because a lot of different things are going to be attached onto that. A lot of muscles in the back, muscles of the chest, different muscles of the torso, deltoids, you know, so a lot of different groups. Right down from there, we are going to have the ulna, which is the main bone for the forearm. So that's the bone that's going to create kind of like the bump here at the elbow, and it's the bone that's going to be creating the bump also on the outside of the hand. And then on the inside, we're going to have the radius. So that's going to be the other bone that runs parallel to the ulna. It's the one on the side of your thumb. Now the reason why we have 2 bones there is to give us greater mobility with the wrist and allowing us, you know, the dexterity that we have, but more specifically allowing us to rotate this way. So those 2 bones are going to be there to support a lot of the different muscles of the hand, muscles of the forearm, and some of the upper arm as well. Then if we move to the rib cage, so the rib cage is going to be a group of bones. They're going to be different, a number of bones in there. So we have all the ribs. So we have 24 ribs in total, 12 on each side. And in the front, we have the sternum. Now the ribs all attach in the back and the spine, and the top 5 ribs, the top 7 ribs also attach in the front directly to the sternum. Not directly because there's a little bit of a buffer. So it's something that's called a costal cartilage, and it's basically the end tip of the rib in the front. And this allows the rib cage to be able to compress a little bit more without breaking. So it gives it flexibility. And all of the ribs are attached to that costal cartilage, but the first 7, that costal cartilage attaches directly onto the sternum. And so those first 7 ribs are called the true ribs. Now the 5 that are below that, the lower 5, those are the false ribs. So why are they called the false ribs? It's basically because they're not connected to the sternum directly. So they're still attached here in the back to the spine, but the bottom 2 ones, they're kind of just floating, so they don't attach in the front at all. The 3 that are in between the true ribs and those bottom 2 ribs, instead they attach, or their costal cartilage attached to the 7th rib. So it doesn't attach onto the sternum, it attaches onto the other rib. So, you know, that's why they're called the false ribs. But anyways, now moving to the sternum here. So the sternum is the piece of bone in the front here. So you can probably feel it if you touch here. It's the hard part in the center of your chest. So at the top where the 2 clavicles attach, that's going to be the manubrium. Then we have kind of like the bigger portion in the center. That's going to be the body of the sternum. The little spike at the bottom that's kind of pointing downwards, that's going to be called the xiphoid process. So that's pretty much it when it comes to the rib cage. Of course, we haven't really talked about the spine yet, but quickly, you know, the spine is comprised of 33 vertebrae. Now, starting from the top here at the very, like right below the skull, you're going to have the atlas, and then right below that, the axis. And those 2 combined together allow for a lot of different, for a big range of motion for the neck, for the head. And then we're going to have 5 more below that, and those are all cervical vertebrae. So 7 in total, including the axis and the atlas. Then right below that, where the thoracic cage or where all the ribs attach onto, those are going to be called the thoracic vertebrae, and we have 12 of those. Then right below we have 5 lumbar vertebrae. And then finally, at the very bottom of the spine, we have the sacrum, which is basically 5 more vertebrae, the sacral vertebrae, and those are fused. So it's just one piece instead of being independent like all the other ones. And then lastly, at the very tip of the spine, we have the tailbone or the coccyx, which then leads us into the hip bones. So the hip bones are comprised of 3 different parts. So we're gonna have on the outside here, so kind of what we can feel on the outside of a body at the hips. That's going to be the ilium of the hip bone. Towards the front, towards the crotch, we have the pubis, and then right at the bottom, so the lower portion of the hip bones is called the ischium, and then of course attached to the hip bones is the femur. So the femur is the longest bone in our body, the biggest one of them, and then right below that, with the femur sitting on top of it, we have the tibia. So the tibia, another bone that probably a lot of people are familiar with. That's going to be the one bone that creates the bump on the inside of your ankle. So that bump, by the way, is always a little bit higher than the one on the outside. So the tibia is going to be the main bone for the lower leg, the bigger one. But just like with our forearm, we also have another one that's called the fibula. Now, fibula is a smaller bone, a lot less important when it comes to support or weight, and it's really more just like the bones in our forearm to give greater mobility, basically allowing our ankle or feet to rotate in different angles. And there we go. So we have, of course, the skull on top of that. So we're going to explore that a lot more in a future episode. And we have the different bones for the hands and the feet. There's going to be a lot more to explore there. But that's not going to be for this episode. It's going to be for the future. So anyways, that's pretty much it when it comes to the important bones. So those are going to be the bones or groups of bones where a lot of the surface muscles are going to be attached onto. So it's very important that we're familiar with them. And also those are going to basically be the only bones that we take into consideration for the next step of the process, which is going to be to create this mannequin or this advanced stick figure, if you want to call it that. Something that's fairly easy to draw in different angles. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, it's always a lot easier to measure and to figure out the perspective, figure out the pose when you're only working with like sticks, right? So instead of having all the muscle, all the anatomy on top of that, and let's say your arm is a little bit off, now you have to redraw the whole thing with all the muscles. Try to get into the habit of working in different stages and different steps, starting with always the most basic shapes, something that's easy to redraw if you mess it up, and something that you can experiment with a lot easier without taking too much time. And also, bonus, it gives us something to once we're done posing it gives us something to attach the muscles onto. All right, so let's jump into Photoshop real quick, or Photoshop or whatever you want to use, and let's take a look at what this mannequin is going to look like. All right, so here we have our skeleton, and now it's time to simplify this a lot. So what we're going to do for the limbs is keep the bones here, so like the humerus, the femur, as just one bone, so nothing to change here. But for the forearm and the lower leg section, we are going to just combine those 2 bones here together. So we're going to have basically one bone here, one bone here, one here, one here. So very, very simple. And for all the joints, we have joints at the elbows, joints at the shoulders, joints at the wrist. For the hand, we're going to simplify it as just a simple mitten, so just something like this for now. The purpose of this mannequin is really to just pose your characters and maintain the proportions, maintain correct proportions in different angles and different perspectives. All the rest of the details, that comes later. Now at the knee, we're going to have another joint, at the ankle another one, and at the hip another one. And then the torso itself, we can easily kind of trace a box around it that we can split in half to isolate the thoracic cage and the rest of the pelvis. And then lastly, for the feet, you can have just, again, something super simple, in a simple triangle. And for the head, one circle and kind of like this cup shape right underneath. Now, when it comes to the head and drawing the head in different angles and different perspective, I have a complete video on that subject already. So you can check that out in the top right corner here of the screen. I'll also put a link in the description below. And now that we have these guidelines here, these landmarks, we can start to look at this and try to make sense of it. So when we look at the limbs, you know, we have the full length of the limb here, and we have the elbow at about the halfway point. So let's just go ahead and call it the halfway point. So basically we have a straight line going all the way to the crotch, right? So the entire length of the torso pretty much. And then we have the hand below that. So the hand always goes a little bit lower than the crotch, but basically super simple. So as soon as we have kind of like the torso here, which is basically just two squares, depending if it's a female or a male, you know, you might want to have those squares be a little bit more, a little bit longer for females, or a little bit more square for males. So slightly wider in this case for male. But either way, the length of the entire body, that's also going to be the length of the arms. And we just have to split it in half to figure out where the elbow goes. And looking at the leg, we have a very similar situation here where we have the entire length of the legs equivalent to the entire length of the torso plus the head. So if we take this whole guy here, this whole skeleton, and split it in half, we land right here at the crotch. So when we have the head, all we have to do is basically just take this length from the head to the crotch and add that again to get the length of our legs. And then the knee is a little bit lower in this case, you know, it's not exactly at the halfway point, but we're just gonna go ahead and place it right in the center for simplicity's sake. And just like that, we already have kind of all the guidelines that we need for our mannequin. So if we clean this up, we start with a rectangle or two boxes on top of one another for the torso. Then to figure out where the head should stop at here, so the upper limit for the head, what we have to do is basically take one of those rectangles, one of those boxes, and calculate about 3/4 of it. So that should give us about something like this. So then we're gonna have a bit of the neck and then the rest of the head. From there, we can start to draw our joints. So for the shoulders, we can trace the joints on the outside here. For the hips, it will vary. So for men, we can trace them on the inside of the box. And for female, what we can do is draw them on the outside here to give it a little bit more width. That would be a little bit more accurate. So there we have it. And then finally, you know, since this doesn't really look like a torso, what we can do is slim it down at the waist. Chop, chop, just like that. And that would be pretty much it for our mannequin. So super simple to draw, super easy to remember because all the limbs can just be split in half to figure out the joint in the center. So for the knees and the elbows, you can also figure out the size of the head based on the sizes of your boxes for the torso and figure out the length of the limbs also with that torso length. But now obviously this isn't a flat cutout like this. This is actually supposed to help us draw the character in 3D. So when looking at this shape here, what I see is all cylinders. So we have a big cylinder for the body. So it's not necessarily a box in this case, it's more of a cylinder. From the side here, it looks like a box. But it really is a cylinder, kind of like a flat cylinder, right? The entire body is not going to be like that. It's going to be more like an ellipse, something like this. If we were to look at it from the top, just like we can see here, you know, more of an ellipse. And so to trace something like that, of course, we start with the torso. So we're going to go ahead and start with the ellipse at the top here. And this is something that is great also to practice just drawing basic shapes in perspective, because that's really what we're playing around with here. Just super simple shapes, in this case a simple cylinder. And what's great with that is well, we can place it in different angles and it should be fairly easy for most of you. And then very important, just like we had here, the separation in the center, making sure that we have that line going down the middle of our cylinder. And then finally we can taper the center, readjust that line here, shave off a little bit of volume, same thing here. And what I like to do once we have something like this here, like this simple cylinder, is to split it in half. So almost as if you were to cut it right down the center, something like this. In this case, you know, it's not facing us, it's facing this side. So this is the indication, you know, where this is pointing. So it's not pointing towards us directly, but a little bit to the side. We're going to carry that here towards the front, all the way down. In this case here, maybe it's facing in a different way. Now with this length here for the torso, we can also place the head. So it's going to be about the same length, but 3/4 of it. So right about here, that'll be the top of the head. We got to consider that this is in perspective. So what we can do then to make things a little bit easier, if you're not too sure, you know, exactly where you should place it, is what we can do is continue the line that we have here in the front and basically all the way up to 3/4 of that. And we can do the same, you know, we can take the same distance here and add it in the back as well. This is going to give us kind of like a nice little square here in 3 dimensions where we can have basically the top of the head be right there in the center. Then we can start to draw the circle. Then we can erase those guidelines here. And for the neck, basically we want the neck to land on this line here, right? So that's going to be in the center in between the 2 shoulders at equal distance. But since we're going to add a lot of muscles onto that later, we don't have to worry too much about the perspective here. So what I like to do is just kind of like a nice little stump here, making sure that the bottom of it lands right here on that line. So kind of like this. You can almost trace a ball. That can work too. And I can carry the split in half here onto the neck. So that line here should match. It should be a continuous line. And then down the chin and into the face. And now the rest is pretty easy. We can split that in half if we want. Again, sideways. And then we have the location for our shoulders. So this one here, little ball, is going to be behind the cylinder. We have also the location for our hip joints. We have the length of the entire torso. So that's going to give us the length of our arms. Now, if you want to pose the arms, for example, well, we can start by figuring out, you know, how long they should be. So something like this. And so once you have this length here, you're much better prepared to actually deform it, rotate it along the joints, and be able to maintain the same length here. Because, you know, those proportions are very important. If your proportions are not correct, or if they're correct when you look at it from the front here, but as soon as you pose your character in different angles, different poses, if you can't maintain those length here, then things won't work. And the purpose of this mannequin here is to make it simpler for us to measure these distances here, because it's just a simple line, right? So a point, a line, a point, a line. There's really nothing more simple than that when it comes to measuring things. And it's a lot easier to measure, or to be able to tell that, you know, are these 2 things equal versus are these 2 things the same length? I don't know, maybe not, you know, it's hard to tell, but with a straight line here, a lot simpler. So that's the whole point. So I'm gonna go ahead and place those joints first, and then we can connect the dots. We want to have a little bit of thickness, you know, for the arms, because those are in fact just cylinders, just like the torso is. Those little limbs here, those little sections of the limbs, those are also cylinders. Then you can draw the hands, simple mittens, again, super simple. And finally the legs. The legs are going to be, as we remember, the entire length of the torso plus the head. So something like this. And we can do the same process here. Something like this, super simple. So let's clean this up. There we go. So this is what really you should be aiming for. Now, one thing that I really want to reinforce is the fact that, you know, the cylinder here for the torso is not a perfect cylinder. Once again, it's this shape here. It's an oval, an ellipse. If you draw a circle and if you deform that circle in perspective, that is going to be too thick. Now, the rest of the limbs, well, those would be just simple cylinders. Now, one thing that I highly recommend also here, and that's also the reason why I have a little bit of thickness to the limbs rather than them being just a single, you know, simple line, is that they're in fact just cylinders, right? So just like the torso, and by practicing, by drawing those lines here, those cross sections onto that cylinder, it's just a nice practice of seeing different volumes in space. So when the lines are pointing in that direction here, they're curved in that direction, that indicates that there is some sort of perspective going on. In this case, we can see the bottom of the cylinder, we can't see the top. And so by practicing drawing the cross sections here, and depending, you know, the correct cross sections, depending on the angle of your cylinder in space, it really trains your eye to understand the volumes better. It's a lot more helpful when it comes to understanding, you know, the direction of the cylinder and the perspective of the cylinder, to have those little lines here than it is to have, you know, something like this without any of those indications. I mean, this is still correct, but it's a little bit harder to figure out, you know, the volume of this thing here. When you reinforce it every chance you get, it makes the volume read a lot better. So highly recommend you try that. But as far as the mannequin, we're set, you know, this is it. This is the mannequin that you should be practicing. It's as simple as it gets. All we're working with here are cylinders for the entire body, except the head, the hands, and the feet. And really, you know, when it comes to adding muscle to this, it should be very, very simple. Clavicles, sternum, ribcage. To the sternum, we have a pectoralis major attached onto the humerus. On top of that, we have the deltoids, also attached onto the humerus, but starting here at the scapula, and the clavicles. Next, we have the neck muscles, sternomastoids, trapezius, biceps, brachialis, triceps, brachioradialis group. Don't worry, all of these muscles will cover in future episodes. Then we have all the extensor muscles, all the flexor muscles of the forearm. Same thing on the other side here. Biceps, triceps, brachialis, brachioradialis group, extensor muscles, flexor muscles. Then from here, going down the torso, we're going to have our abdominal group going all the way to the crotch. First set of abs, second set of abs. Right here, we have the belly button. Then in the back here, you can probably see part of the latissimus dorsi, serratus anterior muscle, obliques. Then moving down to the legs here in the back, we're gonna have the glutes. We can see them from this angle here. Now, before moving down to the legs, we can add the ilium here of the hip bone. So just right above the hip joint right there. So the obliques are going to attach onto that. And also the main muscle for the thighs is going to be the quadriceps. So quads here will start at the tip here of the ilium, basically just a big teardrop shape, and the quadriceps meaning 4 different heads. So we're going to have only 3 that are visible. On the outside here we have the vastus lateralis, on the inside we have the vastus medialis, and sandwiched right in between we have the rectus femoris. Then covering the attachment point here for all of those, we're going to have the tensor fasciae lata, which is a smaller muscle here that quickly turns into the iliotibial band, which is going to be a band of tissue running all the way to the knee on the side of the leg. On the inside here, we're going to have a small muscle here that attaches onto the hip bone and onto the humerus and inserts onto the humerus. So that's going to be called the pectineus. We have another one then, the abductor longus, same idea, attaches at the hip bone and onto the femur. And then back here, and then starting in front of the tensor fasciae lata, we're going to have the sartorius, which is a long band of muscle that runs on the inside of the leg and attaches in front of the knee here. And then maybe we'll be able to see the gracilis, which is another long muscle running parallel to the sartorius for the most part. And then we have a crotch. Then we can move down here. So we're going to have the kneecap here in front, the patella, and then the patellar tendon going down here, creating kind of like 2 sections to the knee. The upper section, which is basically the lower part of the femur, and then the upper section, which is the top of the tibia. And then on the inside of the leg, we're going to have all the muscles of the posterior compartment. So those are going to be the calves, pretty much. Towards the front of the leg here on the outside, we're going to have the anterior compartment. And then from this point of view here, a little bit harder to see, but we're going to have the lateral compartment, which is the last group of muscle for the lower leg, running here on the side of the leg. And so this is just a really, really quick and dirty summary of the stuff that we're going to be looking at in the future episodes. And of course, looking at this into much more depth. But as you can see, once we have a skeleton like this or a mannequin like this, it's incredibly easy when you know your anatomy to create a figure that looks believable, that looks realistic, granted with a little bit more work than what I've put in. So I think that the proportions for this mannequin here is very straightforward. We can easily remember the different distances because most of it is based off kind of like the starting unit that we have here, which is going to be the box, the initial box that we have for the torso. And everything else is kind of derived from that. Anyways, this is going to wrap it up for today, for this episode. So we've covered the main bones and groups of bones when it comes to the human skeleton. And then we took that information and turned it into a simple mannequin like this. Super easy to draw, easy to remember how to draw it. And more importantly, it's going to be a big help when we look at the muscles in future episodes. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope this was helpful. If it was, tell your friends about it, tell your dog about it. If the information was useful, it'd be awesome to spread it to more people. All right, that's a wrap for episode 1. I'll see you guys next time.